Let me just say one note of explanation because I'm not sure that you will understand what I'm about to say. For those of you who aren't farmers, that might be a few of you. For those of you who are more urban type people, you may not be aware of the farming realities, at least here in Canada. I don't know about in Ontario, but at least in the western part of the country where farms are big, farmers take their equipment very seriously, and they tend often to be very loyal to the brand of tractor and combine and equipment that they have. And in the agricultural equipment world, paint color is huge. So you don't just paint a tractor any color. Your color signifies who makes it. So a John Deere tractor is always green with yellow. And a Case IH, Case International, is always, you're not farmers, red, unless you go way back and it was beige, before they were together, and International was red and Case was beige. And Ford is always blue, and back in the day, New Holland was always bright yellow, stuff like that. It's very important to them. The color matches the type. Preliminary information. All right, so let's look in now on a hypothetical farmer. We'll call him Farmer Fred. Now it is quite early, very early on a cool morning, and Farmer Fred, yawning with bloodshot eyes, stumbles along in the morning, making his way to his, what kind of tractor is this? John Deere tractor. It's sitting there in the, beside the shop where he left it very late last night after the rain brought his spraying to an end. And so he crawls up into the cab and immediately tries to start it up right away. Is that okay? Like, I don't know. No, it's not okay. It's a diesel. You don't just do that. You have to let certain things happen first. And so his poor tractor struggles and coughs and chokes and sputters. Listen here, dear John. Maybe I should let you know that Farmer Fred is in the habit of talking to his tractor. Listen here. Quit complaining and start. I was too tired to plug you in last night. I don't have time to wait for your glow plugs to warm up. So get running. John Deere, indeed, you run more like a lame mule than a deer. You say that in some parts and you're like run out of town. So Farmer Fred, as his tractor tries to get going, hooks up some seeding equipment and off they eventually go. We can check in with him a little bit later, and he is seeding. He's put on the equipment, and he's in the middle of seeding his first quarter of land. A quarter section of land, 160 acres. And here we find him arguing with his tractor again. Whether or not the tractor actually argues back, I'll leave that for your own, imagination. Oh, I know what you're up to, John D., says Fred. I see that fuel gauge, I see it. But let me make it clear right now, I'm not going to put any more diesel in this tractor until this quarter is finished. Do you have any idea what fuel costs these days? And while we're at it, you better just keep going. I don't care if you have to run on air, but I'm putting no more in until we get this done. And by the way, I want you to know there's going to be no more oil for the rest of the season. All of these inputs are killing me. Poor Farmer Fred. Poor Farmer Fred's tractor. A few minutes later, we see Farmer Fred. He's doing a very unusual thing. He's standing out in his field beside his tractor, and he's doing quite a creative and interesting dance, or something is going on. And we find out that what's happened is he has just kicked one of the tires, which happens to be mired down in mud because Farmer Fred was foolish enough to take out his tractor after it had rained all night. And it's stuck. And Fred is really hollering with passion now. You miserable green and yellow turtle. I demand that you put your four-wheel drive into action and get yourself unstuck out of this mud right now. I'm warning you, JD, if you don't get unstuck and get going soon, so help me, I'm going to take you back to the shop and I'm going to paint you red. Ooh. Now let me ask you, even if you're not a farmer, is that any way to treat a tractor? What would you think of a person, of a farmer like hypothetical Farmer Fred? What would you think of a guy like that? Today I would like to talk about, and I invite and encourage you to think about, the principle of the munching ox. The principle of the munching ox. It's a principle that's been around for a long, long time, but I also believe it's a principle that is still very relevant for us today. So let's look up a passage, one of the passages in the Scriptures where this principle is mentioned. If you've got a Bible available to you, find 1 Timothy. And we're looking for 1 Timothy chapter 5. Towards the back of the Bible, if you have a paper version where you can orient yourself, 1 Timothy chapter 5. I want to begin reading at verse 17. There's a letter from Paul written to Timothy. He's given him a bunch of instruction and information, and we're jumping kind of into the middle of it. But 1 Timothy chapter 5, beginning at verse 17. So Paul writes, "Let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in word and doctrine. For the Scripture says, 'You shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain,' and the laborer is worthy of his wages." So there it is, in verse 18, the principle of the munching ox. I'd like us to look, what we always should do when we look at the Bible, look first at this principle in its context here in 1 Timothy. And once we've done that, then consider what we should always do next, how it could impact our lives today. Verse 18 is basically made up of two quotations which state, in essence, the same general principle. The first one, "You shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain," that is a direct quotation from Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4, from the Old Testament portion of the Bible. It's a quote from the Old Testament. The second quotation, "The laborer is worthy of his wages," that is quoting words of Jesus, ones which are recorded from our scripture reading, Luke 10, verse 7. And these words form part of the instruction that Jesus gave to his disciples when he sent them out 2 by 2 to go out before him. And I think, just as an interesting side note here, I find it interesting to see how Paul sets words of Jesus side by side with words from the Old Testament as both having the same authority. For Paul, both quotations, and I think for us, both quotations should be considered and understood to be the Word of God. All right, but why did Paul mention this principle of the munching ox in this letter here to his younger associate Timothy? Well, this is not complicated. This is very straightforward. Paul quotes these scriptural principles in verse 18 to support the instructions that he had just given in the previous verse, in verse 17, the instruction about elders being worthy of double honor. Now, the truth is, we don't know just exactly how this worked in the days of the early church. You know, sometimes when you hear discussions maybe about women's ordination or something, you get the impression sometimes that we think we know exactly how the church functioned and how it was organized and how it worked in the early days. But the truth is we don't. We don't exactly know how it worked. So some suggest that the honor that it's talking about here simply refers to respect that would be given to the elders. But the quotations then that we find in verse 18, they strongly imply that Paul seems to be talking here about actual wages being paid to regular full-time leaders in the church. And this can get kind of confusing studying this for us today because we don't, again, know exactly how church leaders function in the days of Paul and Timothy. We don't know exactly how the church was set up and how that worked and who did they hire and who didn't they hire. And what we tend to do is what humans do. We tend to take whatever our own current context is and our own current understanding, and we just automatically impose that on the past and assume that, of course, they do what we did. But we don't know for sure. Maybe they did quite similar. Maybe it was a bit different. We don't know exactly. Today, in our setting, most of our elders in local churches, they're volunteers, right? Volunteer lay people. And then along with this, most churches are appointed one or more pastors, and they're sort of like full-time paid elders. But it's interesting to know that in the New Testament, the Greek word episkopos, which is usually translated as bishop or overseer, that word in the Old Testament and the New Testament was used interchangeably with another word, Greek word presbyteros, which is usually translated elder. Those two terms, bishop, overseer, or elder, were often used interchangeably to refer to the same people functioning in the same way. And then here we have Timothy. He's sort of like a leader of the elders of the different churches of Ephesus. So maybe if we were to take our denominational context today, we might call him like the president of the Greater Ephesian Conference or something like that. But the point is that Paul was confirming, by quoting the principles in 1 Timothy 5:18, the point that he was confirming was that faithful full-time leaders of the church deserve to be paid appropriately for their service according to the practices, whatever the setting was of the church at that time. He was saying this is a principle that's valid for the church today. All right, so that's why he was quoting it there. Let's move now to the principle of the munching ox and think about it, the relevance that it should have for us today. I would like to suggest for your consideration today 4 areas in which the principle of the munching ox should have an impact on us as Christians. How many areas? Isn't that a lot better number than 14? Amen, Pastor. There is hope for lunch. First of all, the principle of the munching ox should affect our attitudes and practices regarding tithes and offerings. You know, from Old Testament times, God's plan was that his full-time workers and his work would be supported by the tithes and the offerings of his people. And it's a fact that, you know, we know this is true. Everything belongs to God, but he only specifically directs us to return to him 10%. That is a tithe of our income or our increase. And this tithe is used to financially support those who work full-time in God's service. Along with this, God asks us to consider what he has done and is doing for us. And then in response to that, and out of gratitude for that, and according to our ability, he then asks us to give him offerings beyond the tithe that we return to him. And these offerings are used to support the various aspects of his work and his mission around the world. You know, way back, Genesis 14, verse 20, we have a record in the Bible of Abraham returning tithe to God. This is a long-standing human principle set up by God. In Numbers 18:21, God says, "Behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tithes of Israel as an inheritance in return for the work they perform, the work of the tabernacle of meeting." But God's plan that those involved in full-time ministry be supported by the tithes of his people did not end in Old Testament times. It wasn't a temporary program. And Paul makes that very clear and outlines that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. So I'd like to go there and just read a little bit of 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and see what Paul had to say about this. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Now, Paul had done an interesting thing. He, as a full-time worker, had a right to be paid, but he had made a choice for a number of reasons to not accept any pay for what he was doing. But in defending his choice and also defending his status as an actual apostle, in doing that, he makes it clear that God's plan for the support of his workers had not changed. So he's talking to them about why he did what he did, and he's giving them a little bit of reason why he did what he did, but he's also careful for them to understand that what he did was not to be taken as an expectation, as a new system. So he's trying to explain that. And some were saying, "You're not even an apostle. You don't take any money because you don't deserve any, because you're not even the real deal." And he was saying, I'm just making this choice. So he's explaining this to them, but in doing that, he outlines what the principle is. So if you're there at 1 Corinthians 9, I'd like to begin reading at verse 7. As Paul is talking about this. He said, "Whoever goes to war at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit? Or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock? Do I say these things as a mere man? Or does not the law say the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses," here it is again, "you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain." Is it oxen God is concerned about? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we, that is he and his fellow apostles, have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. So he's saying we have a right to be paid, but we're choosing not to be paid. But then lest they get the wrong idea from that, oh, this is a new entitlement, he goes on and says and clarifies, verse 13, do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar? Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. So it's the principle of the munching ox. God's full-time ministers are workers, and thus his work can only be supported properly if people are faithful in returning their tithe and giving him offerings. The principle, it calls us to faithfulness in this area. Is this important? Well, let me read 3 sentences from Ellen White's book, The Acts of the Apostles, page 341, to give a little perspective on whether or not this is important. Here's what she wrote. That there may be funds in the treasury for the support of the ministry and to meet the calls for assistance in missionary enterprises, it is necessary that the people of God give cheerfully and liberally. A solemn responsibility rests upon ministers to keep before the churches the needs of the cause of God and to educate them to be liberal. When this is neglected and the churches fail to give for the necessities of others, not only does the work of the Lord suffer, but listen to this, but the blessing that should come to believers is withheld. Let me add here a kind of an amusing sentence on this subject from Lang's commentary. Lang said, the minister must always remember the word of the Lord, freely ye have received, freely give. But the church, for its own interest, should not wish this rule applied too literally. What he's saying is sometimes we kind of fall into that mode of thinking that we should have everything for free. And he's saying that's not really good for the church. Following God's plan of supporting his work and workers by the practice of returning tithe and giving offerings is really for our own good. You know why? It protects us. It helps protect us from selfishness. And it's really an issue of God's lordship. Do we trust him enough to follow his system? You know, if all members were to be faithful, and the truth is all members are not faithful. The evidence, the statistics are perpetual and overwhelming. That probably not even most members are faithful in giving tithe. Some sort of partially give tithe. I don't know if you can actually even do that. But if all members were to be faithful, even just in giving tithing outside of offerings, certainly more workers could be supported. It's an interesting principle to think about. You know, in the last, I don't know, quite a number of years, maybe a decade and a half or something like that, or more. There has been talk and there has been discussion and there has been a call, at least particularly from North America. I don't know about other places because this is the context I'm in. But there's this question always out there about how our tithe money is distributed. And there is a call, there has been a kind of a persistent call for more of the money to stay here in North America. You know, and it tends to most often come from larger churches. And the claim is that, we should be able to keep more of the money here so we could hire more staff for our local church. Why do we send all this money all over the world? Why don't we keep more here? And the argument that often comes up is, well, it's challenging to compete with the programs of other large churches that have a bigger paid ministry staff. Because different denominations have different structures, right? We're in a worldwide structure where we're all one group around the world. I remember when I lived in Saskatoon, we were looking at the possibility of a new facility, and I think it was a Methodist church was selling their facility. A very active church. And I remember going and looking at their church. It was beautiful. It had so many spaces and rooms and places. And it was also interesting to be there and visit a little bit and realize that they had, I don't know if it was like 18 or 19 or 20 full-time paid pastors. They had like a pastor for AV. That's all he did. Just make sure AV is wonderful every week. Pastor just for children, a pastor for youth, a pastor for like opening the door and saying hello, like pastor for everything. And sometimes we're like, oh man, we need to have more money so we could be like that. What does the principle of the munching ox have to say to an attitude of wanting to keep more of the tithe for ourselves? I think it calls us to think about the system we have and maybe ask the question, aren't all of God's full-time workers deserving of support no matter where in the world they live, or how big or how small the congregations are that they serve? The principle of the munching ox should make us think about these stewardship issues. Yes, it is a stewardship issue, how and where best we make use of our full-time workers, but the principle should make us think beyond just ourselves. All right, that was number one. Number two, the second point about the principle of the munching ox is that it should affect how we treat animals. Now, it's true, and don't get me wrong, of course, people are always more important than animals. And Paul in 1 Corinthians 9 showed that this principle has a much wider scope than just animals. That's very clear. Nevertheless, I think it's significant that God included in his laws, think of all of the laws he had to share with his people. He included in these laws this provision for oxen to be able to munch. You know, in an often cold-hearted society, God reminded his people that even in day-to-day stuff working with animals, they needed to show some tenderness, even for animals. Apparently, walking on the grain to remove the chaff could be a pretty uncomfortable thing for the oxen's feet. In fact, if they were overworked at this task, what would happen is the ox would usually go lame. So if you worked him too hard, you would lose him. And most of them were hymns. And so God's law allowed that the oxen be able to at least, eat some of the grain they were walking on. Unpleasant task, but maybe they could have a little break, munch a little bit, have a little bit of nourishment, enjoyment in their lot in life. What a God. The principle of the munching ox shows that God cares for the animals he created, and I think he expects us to value his creation in the same way. And again, applying the principle is for our own good. When we apply the principle to our returning of tithe and giving offerings, it helps protect us against selfishness. When we apply the principle in regard to how we treat animals, I think it helps us to be more compassionate and kind. Because, really, if you can't even treat animals with kindness and compassion, how in the world do we hope to be able to treat people well? I mean, really. In their book, Glimpses of God's Love, James and Priscilla Tucker tell of how the British government has had cats on its payroll for well over 100 years. These two guys are literal cats that now work for the British Postal Museum to represent all of the cats well over a century that worked for the British Postal Museum. Apparently in the mid-1800s, the British postal system had a problem. What is the job of the post office? What's their business? Very good. They're supposed to pass on the mail, right? It's very hard to do that when mice eat the mail. It's very hard to deliver mail that a mouse has eaten. And they were having that problem. And they tried all kinds of stuff. They tried poison, they tried traps, but the mice kept on nibbling. Ironically, like they're doing in the wall right in my office. I'm banging on the walls all the time. Nibbling, nibbling, nibbling. So in 1868, the secretary of the post office in London ordered that 3 cats be hired to tackle the problem. This was it was a discussion, it was a written document. They hired these cats, and they were allotted a weekly wage of 4 pence each. Cats had a salary. But, this is true, but the secretary said if the number of mice is not reduced in 6 months, then the cats were going to be fired. Literally, this was these were employees of the British government. So apparently they hired the cats, they went to, I don't know what kind of interview process they did, because I can only imagine interviewing a cat, but they went to work, and the number of mice and rats was so drastically reduced that the secretary gave his approval to hire more cats. They hired cats. And over the years, the pay improved considerably, not without some discussion. At one point, someone said, you know what? You're raising everybody else's pay, but you're not raising the cat's pay proportionately. And there was a discussion about that. And they boosted up the cat's pay. And at the time they wrote this story, which was in the early 80s, and actually in the mid-80s is when the British postal system stopped hiring cats. Their last cat came off the payroll. But in the early 80s, one of the highest paid feline employees of the British government was a tailless mouse hunter by the name of Kojak. And he was earning £1 and 8 shillings per week. I have no idea what that means, but it's a lot more than I pay my cats. I don't pay them anything because they don't do anything. And his boss said that most weeks Kojak leaves a couple of rats and an array of mice on my desk. Kojak was a smart worker, right? You should always make sure the boss knows that you're doing your job, right? So the truth is, today in our world, in our time, at least in this part of the world, with so many machines and technology that we have, we frankly don't use animals to work nearly as much as, of course, in days gone by. But the principle of the munching ox says that whether animals are used for work, if they're used in recreation, if we just pamper them as our pets, we should treat them with kindness and consideration. Because you know what? Things that make me angry, like it's fine to have an obedient dog, but I'll tell you, I am personally not impressed by these people that are so tough that they treat their animals cruelly. Have you seen some of this garbage? You know, the guys are like, look at this, I'll have my dog jump up and hang from a bar, and I'll go off to work for 8 hours and come back, and he's so obedient, he'll still be hanging there. Oh, I'm so tough. No, you're stupid. You're cruel buffoon. I don't think that's right. Now I realize we probably all have different ideas about how animals should be treated and used, right? Different cultures, different places. Some people are like, animals stay outside. Some people are like, oh, animals should be inside. And we all have our own ideas on that. Animals should be eaten. They shouldn't be. But for me, I don't like the thought of any animal suffering. I really don't. And yet you can call me a hypocrite because I kill mosquitoes on sight. No, I do. And spiders in my house. Like, they say there's always spiders all around you. That's fine. But if I see it, one of us has to die if it's inside my house. No, really, it's him or me or her or me or whatever it is. But I don't go out looking to kill them. I don't go out hunting them down. And I'm not cruel. I don't pull off their legs and watch them writhe around. I can't stand stuff like that. So if one of us is going to die, it's going to be as quick and painless for both of us as possible. So you know what? Go ahead and use steel wool on your non-stick baking pans. Go ahead and leave your Craftsman tools out in the rain. Go ahead and use your clarinet as a drumstick if you want to. Don't bother, subscribing to any kind of antivirus scanner for your computer system. You can fuel your Freightliner with regular unleaded. Feed Smarties through your printer. Treat your machines and your tools and equipment as badly as you want, but make sure you treat animals in a humane manner. The principle of the munching ox, I believe, calls for us to pause and consider even our treatment of animals for our own good. Now, the last two areas that are impacted by the principle of the munching ox kind of go together as two sides of the same issue. So point number 3 is that the principle of the munching ox should affect how we treat our employees. So first of all, as a church and in our denominational institutions, this principle calls for us to pay our workers fair and adequate wages. It calls for them to be treated with respect and Christian courtesy. Those who serve on hiring boards need to keep in focus this principle of the munching ox. And I can say that during my decades of being employed as a pastor with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, I can honestly say I think I've been treated fairly well by my employer. It's been a good setting to work in. Yeah, I grumble from time to time. There's some little annoying things from time to time, but overall, I've been pretty blessed to work for whom I work. However, I've also seen on the other side of that coin, the church as an employer treats some people, including some people very close to me, pretty bad, really bad, shockingly bad. And I'm not going to elaborate on that right now or later on. But I just find it's a little harder to take when unfair treatment comes from the church because the principle of the munching ox says it shouldn't happen. Out there in the sinful world, in a cutthroat society, yeah, I expect some unfairness to happen. I'm not totally shocked by that, but I'm always shocked when it happens in the church. And the fact is this, frail humans won't always follow the principle as well as they should, and I'm left with a choice. I can focus on and reflect bitterly on the times when things weren't done right, and I can let that destroy and sour and immobilize me. But I'm better off focusing on simply working for God. And in the sphere that I'm in, applying the principle as best we can. I think that's what we're best supposed to do. Not just look at the bad examples, because they're not the majority. You know, in general, I believe our church does work on the principle of the munching ox. If you look at many corporations, organizations, businesses out there, you've got this wide disparity in the wages of workers, right? Some of the head people receive like huge exorbitant salaries. You know, their little Christmas bonus or end-of-year bonus is far in excess of the whole annual salary of most of the people that work in the organization. You ever wonder about that? And probably many of those people working in the organization aren't receiving a fair wage in comparison to the contribution they're giving for that organization to go forward. In our church system, we don't have that. We don't have those large differences in wages. The conference president, Elder Edwards, the division president, Elder Jackson, they don't make very much more than the pastor of their local church. Very little more. In fact, personally, with all the extra responsibilities they carry, I wouldn't at all begrudge them making a little more than they do. But we have, as a church, set up a system like that where it's not, the big honchos make a killing and the rest of the poor people barely make anything. We've kept it very close. And I think that's because of the principle of the munching ox. And in organizations such as a church, where truthfully the vast number of our workers are really unpaid volunteers, I think the principle of the munching ox calls for these volunteers, particularly those who take leadership. Yeah, we don't pay them because they're volunteers, but at least they should be recompensed with appreciation and respect. And that's something we can all contribute towards. And that, of course, this principle of munching ox doesn't just apply to the church. Any Christian who is an employer or a boss or a supervisor, so you can't be like, I don't know, I don't own the company, so it doesn't matter. No. If there's anybody else that kind of answers to you, then I think you need to take the principle into account. Workers should not only receive fair and adequate pay, but they should be treated with respect. They should be given as good a work environment as possible in the setting they're in to be able to work in. And if we're a Christian with any say in that, we have some responsibility in that. So finally, the flip side of the third point is that the principle of the munching ox should affect how we work. It should affect how we work. And this principle puts responsibility not only on the employer, but it also puts responsibility on the employee. It says that we should expect fair pay for honest work, not fair pay for doing nothing or next to nothing or as little as possible, which is sometimes how it seems to play out. The church has the right to expect effort from its paid workers, as does any organization. In fact, it's interesting, if you look in 1 Timothy chapter 5 earlier on, Paul even points out that even those widows who were receiving a monthly support from the church, there was an expectation that went with that. They were expected to be ladies who had a record of good works. And if you read on to the beginning of chapter 6, he says that even slaves and servants should serve their masters well and with honor, just as a straight across principle. The principle of the munching ox comes knocking at our doors to find out about our willingness. What is most important to us? Is it to serve God or is it to serve wealth? It's right in our face saying what really matters to you. So let's consider kind of a scenario then and think about how this could play out. Let's look at the issue of instructors for our Adventist colleges and universities. You know, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has a worldwide educational system, quite respected, long-standing. And if we are sending our kids to these institutions, what do we expect? We want good professors, good teacher. We want a good education. We want a good degree. We want them to come out prepared for the world's job market, and we want it to be recognized and on the up and up, right? We want good teachers, qualified instructors. We need that to maintain our accreditation. But in real life, that's a struggle because those who are most qualified, frankly, can make far, far, far higher wages if they teach somewhere else, in some other public or private institution. Pretty well guaranteed they'll make way more money if they teach somewhere else than in our schools. So how does that principle play out in a situation like that? I think it impacts several sides of the situation. First of all, are we as a school constituency willing to pay an appropriate wage to instructors who have special expertise, or do we expect very high quality for cheap? I am amazed over the years sometimes with our educational system and our attitudes. Because we're like, we want the best school and the best teachers, and it better be a great program and offer everything. I don't want to pay any tuition. No, it's not tenable. I'll be nicer than I was in first service. It's not tenable. It's not workable. And sometimes we expect the best with no input. That doesn't make sense, and I think the principle speaks to that. But in balance to that, the principle of the Munching Ox also addresses those who could serve the church in these areas, and it makes a call to them. The principle says that in working for God, we should expect to receive adequate and fair wages, but it does not say that we should only work for the church if it can match or beat the best offer out there. Because guess what? It can't. Never will be able to. So if God's people are only going to work for the church if it can match what's out there, and this is a challenge in our educational field, in our health field, how do we have quality institutions but we're not willing to pay what they can get paid out there? How do we get good people? Thank God we get good people. There are people who could make way more, but because of their commitment to God, maybe because of the principle of the Munching Ox, they choose to serve God in that setting and they make less, but they invest in God's kingdom. Thank God for those people. Sometimes it could be considered missionary wages what they get paid. But the principle calls for us to consider whether service to God comes first or wealth comes first. But that's not all there is. It's not just as simple as that. Hold on, I think we're not finished applying the principle to this example. What does or what should the principle of the Munching Ox say to those who do work in various fields outside of the church for much higher wages? And there's nothing wrong with that. Certainly many people do that, and you're not bad if you do that. But does this principle say anything to the person who says, I'm not going to work in the church system because that's pretty meager. I'm going to work over here and make way more. So what does the principle say to that person? Can I suggest to you that perhaps some of the extra that you make, could perhaps a bit of that be channeled to help support those who are doing the same job for less and make the system stronger? Maybe the principle even speaks to those of us in that setting. And yet, as we sit here as a group of people, there are probably many, many more who are not in this position of receiving premium wages. I just don't know what to do with all my money. Rather, it seems the truth is more and more many of us are struggling just to make ends meet, right? And many people are left with that feeling that they're not receiving fair or adequate compensation for their work. So at least they don't have to worry about this principle, right? Wrong. I think the principle of the Munching Ox applies even to those of us who might be in that position as well. Because the fact is, often in this world, it seems like employers want the most amount of work for the least amount of pay, and in response and reaction to that, employees want the most amount of pay for the least amount of work. That is a recipe for conflict and disaster. That's never going to work, right? Do a lot of work, I'll hardly give you anything. I don't want to do much work, give me lots. That's hard. The principle of the Munching Ox implies that employers have to answer to God for their treatment of employees. But the same principle implies that employees have to answer to the same God for their attitude in their work. It's all around. And I think that's why our denomination, at least in this part of the world, historically has not supported nor recommended the involvement of its members with labor unions. And this is a sticky issue, right? Because the history of labor unions that there has been some good that has come from it. There have been certainly situations where general labor was finally given some fairness and some adequate compensation. So it, to be honest, has not been all bad. But unfortunately, the picture is also not all good. When you look at the whole history of it, far too often it seems that what has happened is the unions have tended to bring employees down to the low levels of some unfair employers. And what accompanies that can become the selfishness that causes the problem in the first place. So it's a hard thing. I remember a lady who was a member of one of my churches. She was an elder in our church. She was a nurse, very committed, capable, competent, Christian, godly woman. Very intelligent and thoughtful person. She was a nurse. She had chosen not to be part of the union, which there was Saskatchewan Union of Nurses. But I remember her telling about an experience she had that really kind of set her back on her heels. And what was happening is the nurses were together in the hospital she worked in discussing a potential upcoming province-wide nurses strike. And so the union was there, and they were talking about, how would this play out? What's going to happen if there's a strike? And they started talking about in what scenarios, if you were there on strike, would you be willing to step in and help, even if you're on strike? And they talked about different scenarios, and eventually the discussion got to a scenario of a code situation. I don't know what they are. The hospitals have all colors, right? Code, whatever color you want, and usually it's serious. And they were talking about whatever color code situation, meaning that someone had stopped breathing or his or her heart had stopped. And they said, so if there's this code and you're there on strike, are you willing to help? Are you willing to do anything? There's a person whose heart is no longer beating, they've stopped breathing, you're on strike, what are you going to do? And I remember her sharing her horror at how many of her colleagues, men and women that she worked with, and were good people, or they're helping people, were like, no, I'm on strike. Not going to do a thing. And I just remember her horror, like, what has happened to us? It's that challenge, right, when we get into conflict about work. God's principle of the Munching ox says that you have a right to expect fair compensation for your labor, but the reality is this: there is no promise that in this sinful old world everything's going to treat you fairly. If you don't know that yet, you're very new to this planet. Nevertheless, the principle challenges you to determine to do an honest day's work, because the principle of the Munching ox does not override or eliminate other Bible principles. Those principles like love your enemies, turn the other cheek. Remember that principle of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This principle doesn't override those principles. So it's right to state your expectations for fair wages, but it always needs to be done in a godly Christian manner. So according to the principle of the Munching ox, what should the church do when it sees injustice? Sit back and say nothing? Maybe that's what we do too often. It seems that the principle calls on the church, it calls on us as Christians to keep promoting fairness and to model it to the world wherever we can. We have an opportunity to show the right way. The principle of the Munching ox would seem to suggest that Christians should be the best employers and the best employees. Christians should be the best bosses and the best workers. You should be like, I got a Christian worker, good. I got a Christian boss, good. I know of a family, I know them fairly well, who family had a family business, Seventh-day Adventist Christians. And in the province they lived, because there's legislation about these things, the industry that they were in, the legislation had opened up for that industry to become unionized. So what was happening across the province with businesses like theirs, what was happening most often is the employees were becoming unionized. So for their business, their employees, they knew what was going on. And so they thought, hey, everybody else seems to be joining a union in their business. We should look into it here. And by law, you have to let that happen. And so the union reps came in. They called in a meeting with all the workers and the union reps gave their pitch, right? They're like, here's the deal. This is why you should have us come in, because if you come in, we're going to fight for you. And we're going to guarantee that you get this salary, and we're going to guarantee that you get these benefits and this much vacation, and we're going to take care of you and protect your rights. And they had their little discussion or whatever, and then the union reps left, and the employees were left to think about it. And as they thought about it, they realized that the things that were offered to them by the union in every case was lower than what they already have. We'll get you this pay. They were already paid more. We'll get you this vacation. They had more. We'll get you these benefits. They already had more. So what decision do you think they made? Let's bring in the union so we can have less. No, they said, wow, we have good employers. These people that run our business are amazing. Why would we bring in the union? They're treating us better than what's being promised. What a cool example of the principle of the munching ox by a family who chose to be good employers. What a witness I think that was for their employers. So somewhere, the principle of the munching ox, I believe, touches each one of us. Maybe it's as a worker. Maybe it's as an employer. Maybe it's as a boss or a supervisor. Maybe it's within or outside of the denomination. Maybe it's in regard to your treatment of animals, whether that's in the setting of work or for pleasure. And certainly the principle calls each one of us to be faithful in returning our tithes to God and giving Him offerings. It's an old principle, but it's a good one. The principle of the munching ox. I hope you won't forget it. And I hope that God will help, empower, and guide us to be able to apply it to our life in a positive way.